Now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Professor Huggy Rao is a professor of organizational behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He teaches courses such as human resources management and two executive programs, the Stanford and Human Resources, as well as customer relationships. He is widely published in the fields of management and sociology and studies the social and cultural causes of organizational change. His recent work investigates the role of social movement as motors of organizational change in professional and organizational fields. Huggy, welcome.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Professor Robert Sutton. Bob Sutton is a professor of management science and engineering in the Stanford Engineering School. Sutton is also co-founder of the Stanford Technology Ventures program and of the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, which is a multidisciplinary program at Stanford that teaches and spreads design thinking. He is an IDEO Fellow, a member of the Institute for the Future's Board of Trustees, and consults widely with many organizations. Sutton studies the links between managerial knowledge and organizational action, innovation, and organizational performance. He has received many honors, including named as one of 10 B-School All-Stars by Business Week in 2007. So I've listed kind of both Huggy and Bob's many achievements and things that they've done, but the other thing is that they work a lot together and have spent a lot of time writing books together and doing other things, and so it's always fun to be engaged in conversation with them, which is what we'll be doing today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Huggy.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on reducing organizational drag. First, I wanted to welcome Bob as well, who so graciously has set aside time. And what we thought is both of us would actually have a conversation on reducing drag in organizations. Again, some additional context. One of the things that Bob and I find very useful is as we're developing new ideas, we find conversations to actually be the gateways to understanding. Sitting by myself, at least I can't think about things. Having a conversation with Bob, I find, opens up new doors, new avenues, and the like. And that's why we thought we'd actually have a conversation, with both of us.
I would also add that your questions are especially important, both because we get a sense of how everybody who is watching this feels, and also it gives us fodder to respond to. So, so we especially appreciate your questions and comments.
Absolutely. After Bob and I wrote this, book on scaling up excellence, one of the things we thought was we really needed to think and develop tools. And Bob spearheaded the idea of a project on designing organizational change. And part of the goal of that project is to actually understand drag and friction in organizations. And what I wanted to do was to take a little bit of your time, present some simple facts about friction to set the stage. And then what we'll do is Bob and I will have a conversation about what causes friction, what are some ways maybe to mitigate it, and then we hope to hear from you about your tools, techniques, ideas that you might have as well. First, friction in organizations. We all have visceral understandings of friction. When there is friction, there is noise. Sometimes there is heat. There is grinding. There is also frustration at an emotional level and maybe fatigue. But from the individual point of view, let's give you some data on drag and friction in organizations. One study by Rob Crossman and his colleagues found knowledge workers spend 80 to 85% of their time attending meetings and responding to requests. Instantly, that tells you where friction can lie right there. In the same study, they found that leaders, when they delegate things to their subordinates, they underestimate by as much as 50% the collaboration burdens they actually place on their subordinates. So delegation isn't simply delegation. You're also placing coordination burdens on your subordinates. And another form of friction, of course, I guess, is email. And one other study of a mid-sized firm showed that if you assume it costs 95 cents to process an email, for this medium-sized firm, it costs $1 million. Let's turn to the organizational view. Let's actually turn to the organizational view in just a minute.
getting some adult supervision here.
Thank you. Yeah. So in organizations, friction often is manifested as interruptions. In one ethnographic study by Mark and colleagues, they followed 36 executives for half a day. And stunningly, they found that the average amount of time an executive spent on a task before being interrupted was 3 minutes and 5 seconds. In another study, people spent 12 minutes and 18 seconds on a work domain before switching, and surprisingly, people interrupted themselves 44% of the time, often in response to a question, a request, or a proposal by somebody. One other problem of friction is something called attention residue. The psychologist Leroy and his colleagues found that when people move from one task to another, the previous task has a conceptual or cognitive overhang, and you actually have to unburden yourself of that overhang before you concentrate on the new task. And all of that actually depletes ability and performance. And finally, the organizational effects of friction. The more friction in organizations, employees might quit because of damaged work-life balance. There's also speed is impaired, and we lose agility and speed. And we, of course, don't get the opportunity to innovate or do something called deep work that requires extraordinary concentration. So this is really the background about friction and drag. And just to let you know, we're going to use both of these terms interchangeably. Some of you might, in the question, suggest there are differences, and we're very open to what those differences indeed are. So let me quickly, without further ado, invite Bob into the conversation. Bob, normally when one thinks of friction, one usually thinks of persons, and normally one thinks of assholes. Is that the only source of friction in organizations, or are there other sources?
For those of you who don't know, for better or worse, the reason Huggy's asking this is that I wrote one and I'm now writing another book about the problem with assholes in organizations. But I think actually that's too crude a term in a couple of ways. And to me, there's two parts of it. First of all, what we're doing and what we're trying to do is to really focus on not just friction as something you do to yourself, and all of us, maybe we could be more efficient. I mean, there's books on like essentialism and how if you just manage yourself better, you'd have less friction in your life. But we're really interested in how groups and organizations cause friction, and we'll keep talking about that, and we would love your ideas about the causes and the cures. But on the asshole thing, there are particular sorts of people, and they may or may not be assholes, that I think are especially prone to cause trouble in organization when it comes to friction. And then there are people who are especially prone to get rid of it. And this is one thing that we've been noticing in the various organizations, including the Come Clean Stanford we work at, that you will have two people in very similar positions who they magically, under the same set of rules, the same set of constraints, they find ways to clear the way and things are easy to do. And then there are other people who, for them personally, it's difficult to do it, to get things done. And when you go to them and ask for help, they make things so complicated that everybody around them gets dragged into this vortex. And you could sort of say that there are some people who are like WD-40 and some people who are throwing sand. And there is some specific research that might be relevant on toxic people who add friction. A researcher from New York University actually called these rule Nazis. And these are the kind of people, and we have them at Stanford, and every large bureaucracy I've ever worked with has them. They're people who, when you go to them with any problem, they make it 7 times more complicated than it perhaps needs to be. They pull in all sorts of people. They're constantly worried if everything goes wrong, so it takes 9 times longer to get things done. And one of the things we're interested in is what are the situations that attract and breed rule Nazis, because that behavior actually might be because they're scrutinized so closely by the systems, they make the mistake, they just get slammed. It may not be a personality variable. And then what are the hallmarks of people and systems that are able to get around and do things easily? So there's a whole bunch of other organizational causes we might want to talk about, but one of the things we're interested in is, so what are the differences between people and groups who seem to easily get things done and remove friction from the same system, same set of constraints, versus making everything difficult?
I love the idea of the rule Nazi. I hope all of you can, of course, quickly search your memories and
it doesn't take long for me.
and identify the rule Nazis in your life. I'm curious, Bob, since you mentioned that two individuals, one kind of person clears the way and the other person kind of follows rules. Would you think that the psychological characteristic of openness has anything to do with whether one's a rule Nazi or not? So in other words, are open-minded people less of rule Nazis?
Well, there's openness. I also think that with at least, and there's some, Heather Halverson is the woman who did this research, by the way, that people who, to use this cruel word, rule Nazis, there's people who tend to be so anxious about making a mistake and perhaps have been slapped down so severely for making a small mistake. They also tend to be quite anxiety prone too, that's the way it does it. Now another kind of person might be what they call them petty dictators. These are people who the way they gain control over others is by throwing up difficulties. There's also, to move away from assholes and negative personality types, one of the things, and I'd be curious from some of the people who are watching this to hear if this is something that comes up in your organizations. I actually think that, although it's always interesting to talk about personalities, and they're always very big in our world, some of the things that happens in organizations that cause friction that at least I think we're both especially interested in are when they create incentives for people to add friction. So one of the things that we've noticed in a number of organizations that we have worked with is there'll be all sorts of incentives for you to add a program. So that if you have a new program, a new idea, a new initiative, like you get glory for it, and then everybody all over the organizations gets glory for doing it. Even if you just send emails, like it might create the appearance or the actual reality that you're doing work, and the more people you send it to, the more people know that you're doing work. But there's this thing, and it's sort of like in economics they call it the tragedy of the commons, where the incentives that help you individually get ahead in your career and make a mark and be known, it just adds more and more and more load at Stanford, load on you. I mean, just for example, we have a new set of teaching evaluations at Stanford, and the committee on it worked on it very enthusiastically. And so what they did is they created a situation where, well, I got to spend a couple more hours a year dealing with it. I had to go to a meeting to learn about it. And I honestly don't think the new system's any better than the last system, but all the people who are involved in doing it, they get more glory. So I guess that's good, but so that's one kind of incentive where everybody has incentives to add but not to subtract, and we all suffer from the weight of more and more and more program. And the other thing is, I don't know what it's like in your organization, but in many organizations that I work with, the amount of pay grade that you have, your level of the pay grade, this is certainly true in the civil service, is the more people report to you, the more you get paid. So there's all this incentive for people to build kingdoms, and the way that adds friction is when you have more people, you have sort of more administrators and maybe more faculty members or more direct workers who add more and more load on one another, because size almost always adds friction. So although I think there are some personality types, where my mind tends to go with this problem is what are the incentives in the organization that unwittingly cause friction, and one of them is that each one of us, when we throw something out, we get rewarded, and nobody gets rewarded for getting rid of something. And then the second one is this idea of size, and this is a big theme in our book, Scaling Up Excellence, which is size is almost always causes more friction in bad interpersonal relationships, the more people you add to a problem.
I think what's kind of very striking is Bob has identified one of the important I's that leads to friction, and that is incentives. And, I very much like your point, Bob, that the incentives are asymmetric, i.e., you're rewarded for adding but not for subtracting.
Right.
Headcount being a case in point. But the way I also thought you described the the tragedy of the attentional commons is perhaps when one copies everybody indiscriminately on an email. Is that like another example of damaging the commons, the attentional commons? Now, Bob and I were in an executive program recently where one CEO, if you recall, said that the person who actually kind of copies me on an email, if it's unjustified, that person is going to be fired. Our punishment...
Very tough CEO.
Very tough CEO. Are punishments the only way to deal with damaging the attentional commons, or are there other more mischievous ways?
Well, I don't know if there's more mischievous ways, but certainly at least removing incentives for people to add friction and giving them incentives for them to get rid of it, at the very least, is actually not a bad idea. Another organizational design feature, and this is controversial, so I'll say this and see if we get some reactions out of folks, is everybody talks about how great transparency is and how I've got to share, we've got to tell everybody what we're doing. Well, there is an argument that I don't need to know everything you're doing, and you don't need to know everything I'm doing. In fact, it just overloads me with more, like literally more junk on my mind, and the more it's on my mind, the worse I do on my job. And if you go to the extreme case, to the most secretive organization on earth, it's not the CIA, it's Apple Computer, at least that I know of. And there's an interesting argument, and Huggy and I have talked to insiders, and of course if we use their name, they'd have to shoot us, because it's much easier to get information about the CIA, or as we've seen, or the NSA with all the leaks and everything, but Apple, there's been no breach yet. And one of the things that we know about Apple very well is they are extremely secretive, and outside of the small immediate team you work on, nobody is allowed to ask anybody to know anything. Their employee badges only let them in a very small part of the organization, even quite senior people. And although there are some disadvantages to that level of secrecy, and we could talk about those. I mean, Apple is aren't they the largest, most successful company in the world right now? I think that they're back to number one. It always makes me wonder, although there's some coordination issues and the like, but to me that shows the positive advantage of secrecy, because one of the reasons is they just have less cognitive load, they just have less friction, they just get to work on whatever they're working on, and they can't even know what's going on in the rest of the company.
So we have a related question from the audience.
Oh, thank goodness.
Also somewhat controversial. So one person is asking about collaboration and teamwork. It's often a value that many companies and managers hold very dear, but is that also potentially a cause of friction or drag?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting study about this. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So who was the gentleman, of the person who asked the question?
I don't know. I can find out.
Because that's a really good question, and we need to...
Karen Kulantag.
Yeah. Karen, thank you for that question.
It's a great question.
And that's a very good question. The short answer is, yes, collaboration is a burden. And if you've forgotten everything from this webinar, and maybe you want to remember just sort of one thing, and the one thing is, think about how collaboration actually burdens your best performers. For the sake of this argument, let's assume each one of you listening to our webinar, we'll assume each one of you has 100 subordinates. Let's further stipulate out of the 100, the 10 are at the very top. Now in general, and I'm making a very gross generalization, please correct me, Bob, if I'm straight off the reservation here. On a general basis, if you have 10 high performers, one would assume that 5 of them, they're great performers, but they're high maintenance. They want raises, they want recognition, they want attention from you. Loosely, we can call them because they're never likely to be grateful.
It's sexist, but it's okay.
I'm sorry. Now, the other 5 are people Rob Cross and Adam Grant would refer to as the extra milers, and that's the study.
The givers.
The givers Bob was alluding to. So when you think of the extra milers, this is the other half of your top performers, the remaining 5 in your top 10. These are not only your high performers, but they're also the most helpful people. They respond to everybody's requests for collaboration and help and so forth. And it turns out in a couple of studies, when they receive more than 24 requests in a week or so, they begin to harbor thoughts of leaving the company. The extra milers, they're so cooperative, their main problem is they don't know how to say no, and as a result they also feel the most disengaged. Indeed, we might argue that for many of you listening to this webinar, if you at the end of this webinar have any new ideas, whom are you going to turn and entrust them to? Your extra milers. It's very unlikely you're actually going to go and ask your to kind of help you out. You're going to go ask your extra milers to do this. And so what you're doing is you're putting more friction and more collaboration burden on them while they're the ones being burnt out. Do you agree?
I agree with you, but I would also go back to the organizational consequences, because this study which Adam Grant and Rob Cross did is very interesting, because essentially it's showing that there's a small percentage of people who take the lion's share of the burden for collaboration, and they allow everybody else to do what they want. And so givers like that give so much that they burn out, and there's really a risk. But I also go back to the organizational causes and consequences, because if you are in your team, if you're a senior executive who is into organizational design and incentives, if you reward both, let's call them the free rider superstars instead of using the P word, as much as you or more than you reward the ones who are givers, then there's something wrong with who you're giving an incentive to, who you're promoting. So a lot of this goes back to organizational causes. When we may blame the sort of the people who are doing the free riders, but if they've been rewarded for it, if that's the kind of people you attract, if those are the kind of people you promote, it's actually rational behavior for you to do the work for me and to go to all the meetings and do all the collaboration while I just focus on building my star power, and we get rewarded equally, or me even more. It's partly an organizational issue too.
Yeah, but I hope this kind of clarified your question,
Good question.
Karen. But the other thing I just want to quickly jump on what Bob mentioned about the organizational side is often when I work with executives and ask them, what do you think we should do about the extra milers? And indeed, I'd urge all of you to think of giving a gift to the extra milers when you go back, your own extra milers on whom you heap cognitive load and the burdens of collaboration. Usually executives kind of think of things like, oh, we've got to work with them so that they delegate more. That seems sensible, but the one thing with extra milers we know is if you take away anything, they feel that there's a reduction of their role and their importance, and they're not too happy with it. The other kinds of things that people come up with are, oh, we'll give them a day off, or we'll give them an evening off. Instead, the things that we found that help these extra milers is not giving a day off because they all like to work. It's actually giving the day off free from interruption. That's the kind of reward that we are actually thinking about. So you come to work, you're doing your work, but nobody's bothering you, firing a lot of questions and asking you for help so that you harbor thoughts of leaving the organization. So did that help, Karen?
Yeah, it seems so. I mean, she did say, ask, is there an optimal mix of givers and free riders, etc. But
that's actually a much more difficult kind of question to answer, because the optimal mix of givers and takers is you can easily exhaust the supply of givers, and it's the number of takers
they can tolerate.
Yeah.
So it is also interesting, and this is again more the organizational design approach. That I don't know about the optimal mix of givers and takers. Adam Grant, who wrote the famous book Give and Take, wonderful guy, he would say the optimal mix is Huggy implies, is like 100% givers and 0 takers, but life's not going to work that way, I don't think, in the near future for any of us. But one of the mixed things that I think also really affects friction, which is just now occurring to me, but something that Huggy and I both thought a lot about, is the percentage of people who are specialists versus generalists. Because and this is, and my wife, who used to be a lawyer, used to joke that a generalist is somebody who knows everything about nothing, and nothing about everything. And a specialist is somebody who knows everything about nothing. So, and in organizations, I think that the biggest risk, as opposed to givers and takers, is having too many people who are generalists. And it's funny because I think I'm pretty much of a generalist, because when you have people who are generalists, what you have is a bunch of people who feel obligated to get in one another's faces and tell them what to do and what they ought to do, but actually don't really know that much about it. So they do just enough to insist on reports or new ideas, but they actually don't know how to solve the problem. So, my perspective, I guess this does get back to organizations like Apple, and then I think of Netflix, which I know a little bit, which actually has a lot of specialists and is a well-ran organization, is you need just enough generalists to know how to glue everything together. But once you have excessive generalists, you start having people who throw in friction because they think they know the answer to things that they don't know the answer to.
That's an excellent point, Bob. I mean, this idea of generalism and specialism, I think, so it's not only incentives, but also the depth of capabilities.
Yeah.
That's a really well taken point. I haven't thought about it too. I'm also keeping track of time. We focused on incentives as a source of drag and friction. What about ignorance? And here, and the reason I sort of ask about ignorance...
Yeah, that's related to the generalists. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a cousin. I mean, that's exactly why I was touching on that, because as you said, the generalists were ignorant. But more broadly, what I was thinking of was ignorance as a source of friction in organizations. And I'm reminded of a study by our wonderful colleagues, Dale Miller and Deborah Prentice, where what they did was they asked Stanford undergrads, what is your private attitude towards the consumption of alcohol? And individually, Stanford undergrads said they didn't approve of drinking alcohol on campus. But on the other hand, when they asked the very same Stanford students, what do you think is the attitude of the average Stanford student for consuming alcohol? Their view was that the average Stanford student actually was very permissive in terms of his or her tolerance of alcohol. And is that the kind of ignorance one needs to be worried about? Here it's pluralistic.
It's pluralistic ignorance. Well, that's one kind of ignorance, and certainly, I mean, that is a problem. And obviously alcohol at Stanford is a huge issue. You've been watching the news, but to me, the worst sort of ignorance is when ignorance and arrogance are brought together. And this is the classic time when friction and other horrible things happen in organizations. So the more when powerful people think that they know how everything works, and then they come in and start telling other people what to do. And you have that in your slide deck where when people when superiors assign jobs to subordinates, they tend to underestimate how long it will take. This is a classic problem that happens. But yeah, certainly ignorance is a cause of friction. And as with all management, and this is something that I talk about in Good Boss, Bad Boss, and talk about in a lot of Stanford executive programs, is that the hallmark of a good boss, and this is something that will reduce friction, and it's the opposite of ignorance, is knowing what it feels like to work for them and having enough empathy, sympathy, and understanding of the people that they lead, that they know when to get in their face and tell them what to do, and they know when to back off, either because they don't need the help or actually by getting in, they're making things worse. So this is one of those cases where self-awareness is one of the cures to this malady.
Right. Bob's point about self-awareness being a cure to the malady, again, is well taken, because in this very same Stanford study that both of us mentioned moments ago, what was the solution? Clearly, individual students thought drinking was a bad idea, but they mistakenly thought that the average Stanford student actually was much more tolerant, which was a complete myth. And the quickest way to solve that was to provide each one of them feedback to show, hey, other Stanford students like you also personally disapprove of drinking. And that actually led to a big drop over the next 6 months in terms of drinking on the campus. But I want to pursue another interesting image that your previous comment evoked for me, Bob. The image that your comment evoked for me is a small coterie of powerful people thinking they know everything, arrogance, or put simply confidence, and then the rest of the organization, I sort of thought them as more doubting Thomases in your imagery.
Right.
So when is doubt a source of friction? And how's that different from ignorance? Is that the same thing, or?
Well, to me, ignorance is when you have the confidence to go in and tell people what to do, even though you don't have any idea what the heck you're doing, because you're in a powerful position and you know better. And, you know, at Stanford, just because, I don't know, you're a world-class electrical engineer, that means that therefore you're an expert on organizational design or anything else, which is, you know, this idea of the sort of right stuff mentality. But doubt is not so bad, because if it's doubt where people stop and think about what they're going to do before they do it because they think they don't have enough information or there might be problem, to me, that's constructive doubt, because it's the kind of doubt that Danny Kahneman talks about when you face an important decision, you slow down, and instead of making a bunch of mistakes, you actually think about what you're going to do. And a lot of us believe in rapid prototyping and all that sort of stuff, and to learn by failing. But the hallmark to me of people who have the right amount of doubt and the proper amount of confidence without being destructive is what they do is they find a little place to do an experiment rather than to do something really stupid that ruins everybody's life. And the example I use, and I'm sure that many of you have been involved in large IT rollouts. To use Stanford again, our history for large IT rollouts is not too impressive. And one of the reasons that there's problems with large IT rollouts is that some allegedly very smart people tend to come up with the perfect solution and then roll it out across campus, and then their incompetence and overconfidence introduces massive amount of friction and frustration and fatigue for literally thousands of people who can't deal with their new IT system. And if instead they had done some prototyping, some development in a small sort of pilot area and really gotten it working and then spread it, then there would be much less friction for everybody in the larger system. So that's where, to me, actually, having some doubt that, gee, maybe it isn't right and maybe it isn't ready for 100,000 or 10,000 people to use it is actually a proper way to reduce friction. So but when you get to the point where you're so insecure that you can't act, that's a dangerous sort of doubt.
I'd like to sort of quickly, more questions?
I have one question that I think is related. So Rodolfo Aguilar is asking, what about trust and friction? Does lack of trust create friction, or?
That's a great question as well, Rodolfo.
Nice question, Rodolfo.
I think your question is a wonderful sequel to the discussion on doubt, and what Bob was describing as constructive doubt, if you will. But the moment you use the word distrust, and I find that kind of interesting, because distrust means suspicion.
Yeah.
Suspicion essentially means that one is questioning the motives of the other person. And the moment you begin to question the motives of the other person, clearly the opportunity for friction kind of multiplies. So, a great example of friction caused by distrust often is during the integration of new acquisitions in an organization. I mean, what you actually have is an enormous amount of friction then. In fact, I would argue that if your company, for instance, is acquiring another company or being merged with another company, a very useful way to reduce friction would be right at the due diligence stage itself, identify a series of 100-day improvement projects. We're going to bring in accounts receivables from 15 million to 2 million. We're going to actually improve the answer time on the phone call when a customer calls from like 5 seconds to like 2 seconds or whatever. Obviously, I'm making up these numbers. What those kinds of projects do is they actually give focus to people, and they allow people from both the acquirer and the acquiree to actually work together and to overcome mistrust and distrust. So that's the advantage of doing that. So the short answer is distrust indeed is a big cause of friction.
The other thing, Rodolfo, I think you're really onto something, because the other thing that I think about with distrust is with distrust, as Huggy says, comes suspicion and actually justified paranoia, that you're so worried about being hurt, about being surprised, that you do a whole bunch of very, very time-consuming sort of CYA activities. And I even talk about this when I work with people who have abusive bosses. I tell them to do a whole bunch of things that add friction, which is to document, to go around and check things out. So you have to build a group of friends you don't really need except to support you. And I'm thinking even of some organizations where there's really low trust cultures, including one that Huggy and I worked with years ago when I first met you. That we were talking to fairly senior executives, and they described how when there was an important meeting, there always had to be 7 or 8 pre-meetings that people had in smaller groups to make sure that no one, and this is like, a relatively moderate-sized company, but there was so much fear and paranoia, even at senior levels, that you always had to have 7 or 8 pre-meetings before the real meetings, so there was no surprises, so that you personally weren't in a position to be hurt by others, so that you worked out the politics before. And to me, that's a real sign of mistrust, the fact that things have to be done backstage. And in fact, I talked to a CEO about the most destructive members of his top management team, and I won't quite swear, he called them Bryn Effers, is what he called them. And these are people who in the meeting, they really, really smile at you and agree with everything you do. And then they run around and stab you in the back. And he said when that happens, it just creates a whole bunch of, not only fear is also another problem with friction, but it just adds all this friction to the system. So I think that, to your point, I think that friction is a real, or distrust, mistrust, paranoia, which is sometimes justified, is a real strong sort of undercurrent that causes these problems. Because people have to protect themselves. It's not irrational.
Right. But listening to you, what's also interesting is that confusion also is a consequence of distrust, because you never know why something happens or not. Quickly summarizing, we've actually identified a number of sources of drag and friction in organizations. One was incentives, another was actually ignorance, the third was inequality or power differences that Bob alluded to. The fourth, of course, is distrust. And one takeaway for all of you, thanks to Karen's question, is remember, don't go back and put more burdens on your extra milers. These are the people helping you. Don't shoot yourself in the foot by giving them more to do, because you're going to frustrate them, they're going to be fatigued, they're going to leave the organization, you'll damage yourself. We have a little time, and I want us to kind of quickly investigate another possibility. Is friction always bad? Are there times when we should create friction in organizations? What do you think, Bob?
Well, I think friction is good under some circumstances. One is there are some situations which are really big situations, like things like an acquisition decision, whether or not to lay off people, like having some process where people are actually forced to think about what they're doing and to go through. And there's also another reason where something that might feel like friction might be important, which is that sometimes to do things with enough humanity so it doesn't hurt people and it actually fuels things like trust in the organization, you've got to sort of slow down and do things in a somewhat less efficient way. One of the classic things, back to the asshole question, I get this about once a year. Somebody works for a company and somebody in HR wants to fire people by sending them emails or texts rather than doing it in person. And it's more efficient, it gets rid of friction. But if you want to create fear in an organization, and there's large-scale cases, this Radio Shack at one point fired huge amounts of people by sending them emails. So maybe this might add friction, but I think or get rid of friction, but it creates so many other ripple effects. There's also just a little design thing, and then we'll stop. A friend of ours, Michael Deering, who was head of eBay North America, he's now a venture capitalist. He used to make this argument that in the early days at eBay, and I don't know what's going on at eBay now, there was a big argument between the pure IT type user design folks who just wanted everything to be as easy as possible to get in and out of eBay with your purchase. But Michael's an old retailer. He actually ran a huge retail store when he was in his 20s. And he said the way retail works is we like to sort of slow things down and show things to people along the way that because they might buy them and slow them down. And if you've been to IKEA, and I'm sure many have been to IKEA, that's like the whole theory of the store. It takes forever to get out of the store, and they just show you all this crap, and you throw all this stuff in your cart that you maybe didn't want in the first place. So there might be times when people, at least for capitalistic reasons, you want them to slow down, and also human in decision making. Those are the things that come to mind.
Yeah, those are very nice examples, Bob. I want to pick up on the IKEA one as well. What I heard, Bob say is, hey, you might really need friction when you actually want curiosity and commitment.
Oh, that's interesting.
I always thought, so that's kind of what I got from what you just sort of said. And the IKEA experience is an interesting one because in marketing there's this thing called the IKEA effect. In this study, what they showed was if you ask somebody to kind of pre-assemble some kind of shelf or whatever it is for you as opposed to you making it yourself, people who made it themselves and experienced friction were actually more committed and were much more satisfied. The people who got something made, they only kind of were able to identify the defects. That wasn't done properly, this wasn't done properly. They were still in the consumer mode and not in the producer mode. I'm kind of wondering, should organizations actually create friction right at the stage of hiring?
Well, that's kind of interesting because you're making me think this is a double-edged sword because a lot of what Huggy is talking about is the psychology of commitment, that a lot of organizations make it difficult to be hired, to sort of run you sort of a gauntlet in the early days in the organization because it actually does increase commitment. So the friction increases commitment. But the thing I don't like about that is that you have a bunch of people who went through a very difficult high friction experience and they feel obligated. I did it, so I'm going to do it to you. And so you end up with this sort of
vicious circle.
Sort of vicious circle where everybody adds more and more friction. And in some ways,
it's really nice.
It isn't just friction, it's load. Where you actually see this in a specific case is many may know that for medical residencies, surgical residencies, and so on, that the residents tend to work 90-plus hour weeks, and it causes all of these physical and mental health problems, and is really hard in the profession. And they keep trying to get rid of it, and they actually haven't been very effective at getting rid of it. In part because the residents who are now doctors, attending physicians, and so on, they say, "I did it, and I'm going to do it to you." And so there is that sort of, in this case, cycle of friction and abuse and load that the prior generations do on the new generations because they did it and they want to maintain the self-justification.
This is a really fascinating idea, Bob. The reason I find myself fascinated by your argument is this happens, when we, of course, have these conversations. I do get fascinated. But what you just said, when you were saying this, it reminded me of Dale Miller's work on moral licensing. And Dale's argument when he does these experiments on moral licensing is that, if you do a good deed, that is, you donate $50 to a nonprofit, you're more likely to run through a red light or a stop sign because you think you're a good person.
You're a good person, yeah.
And then you license yourself to do bad things. But just in this lovely account that you gave me, I never sort of thought about it that way. It's sort of like if you've been a recipient of friction, you're going to be more morally licensed to impose it on other people. I find that really quite...
and it's justifying your identity and existence.
Right. That's actually very interesting.
I'm going to ask Bob and Huggy to take a few more questions. So one question that we had come up with from a few different participants is does a small company necessarily have less friction than a large company? What is the relationship between the size of the company and the amount of friction within it?
That's a great question. Here's my quick sort of take on it. I think it was in one of the programs that maybe Bob and I were running, or I forget when I met this executive. And I asked this person a simple question. I said, what's the difference between a startup and a large company? And here was this person's answer. He came back and he said, well, Professor, he said, small companies have big people. And the larger the company, the smaller the person. And that hopefully gives you an idea. It's not that there's no friction in a startup. There is indeed friction in a startup, but what you actually have is the sense of mission and all of this which overrides that. My nephew works in a startup, and I won't mention the name of the startup. I asked him, what's it like? He told me, he said, it's like a labor camp. I just keep working all the time. So there's a lot of friction there too, but people don't feel as frustrated and as fatigued as in a larger corporation would be my wager.
Yeah, so I mean, to piggyback on what Huggy says, I think the evidence is, and back to Michael Deering, I already mentioned, who moved from places like eBay and the like to now he's done early stage financing for more than 100 startups, very successful. And he'll argue that speed is the only real advantage that startups have, but I would sort of add as a caveat that the worst situations are when companies used to be startups and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and management is in denial of the fact that they need some control mechanisms, they need some hierarchy, they need some process, some specialized roles, and they don't accept that they've grown up and have to deal with the fact they're a larger organization. There's actually an interesting example. GitHub, which is now doing incredibly well, went through a period where they just wanted to be a big startup and not have any controls and let everybody do what they wanted. And it led to some pretty ugly stuff. They got rid of one of their CEOs and brought up another guy who's much better. And the first thing he did was to start a process of actually adding big company-like controls, because they became big enough that acting like a startup didn't work at all. So yes, startups have less friction than large organizations, but the worst situation is when you pretend you haven't grown up.
So another question that we've received is, can you share, and I think you've shared a few examples during the webinar, but are there really good examples of companies who've been able to create a culture that has less friction or have been able to very effectively reduce friction?
A good example that Bob and I wrote a case study about was Adobe, where they actually dropped their performance appraisal system because they found out they were spending 90,000 manager hours. They weren't getting anything. So they certainly have taken friction out, but at the same time, given that they've yanked the system out, people are actually learning for, what do we do instead? Can we actually develop something much more lightweight? The other solution I would kind of recommend to people is be mischievous. Think of having rewards like MVP for the person who copies everybody on every email that they receive. Nobody would want to get a reward like
friendly humiliation.
A little friendly humiliation is a good thing. Or MVP, the person who attends the most number of meetings. Things like that, you can actually, be a little edgy, and you can do that as well. So that's another thing to do. But the most important thing is, before you do anything, you might really want to ask yourself or pose a friction and drag test for yourself. How is what I'm doing, how is that causing friction? So let me close with one quick example. And this was an example of a large multinational company. They wanted to reduce costs, and the person who didn't think much about friction quickly pulled up an Excel spreadsheet and said, my God, our sales guys in Germany all have Mercedes sedans leased to them. We can reduce costs by giving all of them cheaper Volkswagens instead. They thought they'd reduce cost. But later, when this executive flew to Germany, one of the salespeople told him, do you know what you did? And the person said, well, we just reduced cost. We took the Mercedes out, we gave you a VW. He said, you have no idea what you've done. He said, look at me. I'm a salesperson. I drive home in the VW. My spouse looks at me and thinks, my God, he's in trouble. The children kind of ask me, Dad, what happened to the Mercedes? My neighbors begin to give us strange looks, thinking, is the family in trouble at the farm? And he looked at this executive and said, as a salesperson, what's the most important thing I need? And this executive said, confidence. And then the salesperson said, what have you done to my confidence with this? You've actually lowered it. To this executive's credit, he realized it and then discovered that they'd bought another company in Texas, and there were a lot of smokers in that company. And that's when he realized that it would be better to launch an anti-smoking campaign there and reduce the insurance premium rather than yank the car out. So it's a good idea before you do anything, ask yourselves, how much friction am I going to create? And to Bob's point, some of the friction that you create may not be visible to you when you make a decision.
Yeah, so I would add just one little thing. There's companies I think of like Amazon and Walmart, which are not the nicest companies to their employees in the world, by the way, and I've worked with both of them. So I'm biting some hands that feed me, but that said, they are organizations where really there is a focus on both frugality and making things easier to do. And then I would just add just a word from actually somebody who teaches in the I&E program, who's one of my charismatic heroes, the young Jeremy Utley. What's the name of the course he teaches?
Empathize and Prototype.
Empathize and Prototype is a class he teaches. And I teach with Jeremy, and Jeremy is the perfect friction reducer. One of his mottos, whenever we're planning lessons or thinking of anything, is I hate wasting other people's time.
There you go.
And I think that, and I see that in how he makes decisions in all sorts of ways. He's always thinking of how can I make things less burdensome for my students, for the executives I lead, for the companies I consult to. And I think ending on Jeremy's motto and just to really hate it and try to figure out how not to be disrespectful to other people's time might be a good motto for all of us.
Brilliant.
Well, so with that, I want to really thank both Huggy and Bob. I'm very much hoping that you enjoyed this hour and that we didn't waste your time and your time, and that you learned and got some valuable insights. And I encourage you to check out any of our offerings at scpd.stanford.edu. All of you will receive a recording to this webinar to share with your friends and colleagues, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.